By the end of Purgatorio 27, it would seem like our story was close to coming to its close. Virgil has accomplished his task. He has saved the pilgrim from his destructive behavior, and he has restored Dante's ability to choose the good. Virgil leads the pilgrim to believe that all that remains is for him to enjoy the fresh and verdant place into which he has been led, and to await the time at which he may look into the beautiful eyes of his beloved Beatrice. He tells Dante, "You may sit down or move among these until the fair eyes come rejoicing." At any moment, then, the reunion between lover and beloved will take place. One of my old teachers, Zig Baranski, summarizes it in this way. After several dramatic days of testing travel through hell and purgatory, which taxed him intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, Dante's character, reassured by an enchanting dream, wakes for the first time on his journey in a peaceful and relaxed manner. Appropriately, he's greeted by pre-dawn splendors, and he soon finds himself on the edge of a perfect garden with the weather of San Diego. I'm paraphrasing just a bit. The pilgrim is nearly home. Indeed, he is explicitly associated with those pilgrims who, returning, stay less far away. The pilgrim seems at last to have reached a deserved haven of calm and repose. He's about to be rewarded for his efforts. And yet the canti which follow most certainly do not depict a moment of calm and harmony, nor do they describe a charming reunion between long-separated lovers. Beatrice is angry, unrelentingly reproachful, and vigorously incisive. The pilgrim, in his turn, is ashamed, confused, and almost at a loss for words. As we will see, something is about to spin terribly out of control. As it turns out, this is not the end of the story the pilgrim and his guide thought they were in for. Rather, Dante Pilgrim witnesses not the serene advent of the lady he had once loved so much, a kind of romantic reunion in this ideal garden, but a supernatural, apocalyptic procession which is accompanied by unnatural signs. Just as he begins to look about the woods for Beatrice, he sees this instead. And behold, a shining suddenly ran through the great forest on all sides, such that it made me wonder if it were lightning. But since lightning, as soon as it comes, ceases, and this lasting shone brighter and brighter, in my thought I said, "What thing is this?" The pilgrim has difficulty even identifying the nature of the approaching event. Che cosa è questa? Precisely because it's not natural. And the images used to describe what he will soon know is a procession become more unnatural as the canto proceeds. A sweet melody courses through the luminous air, as if the sound and the color were the same. The company flames more brightly than the moon at midnight, and as the company of flames advance, the air left behind is transformed into a colored substance, as if they are so steeped in heavenly light that they burn color into the air as they pass through it. For portraying this procession, no natural event seems a suitable likeness. The poet turns to synesthetic blending of images and senses to gesture at what he saw. The world of nature begins to melt down in the heat of this extraordinary event. The advent of Beatrice overwhelms nature. In our last lecture, we talked about the beautiful, moving poetry, which was used to craft a poetic description of the pilgrim's experience of the earthly paradise in Canto 28. But in contrast, we now have a violent, experimental poetry. In earlier canti, you could find traces of the sweet new style, echoes of the poems of Cavalcanti and Guinizelli. And now, that mellifluous, limpid lyricism of the earlier canti is replaced by bizarre imagery, opaque symbolism, strangely symbolic pageants, and intentionally dark and difficult explanations, which make things less intelligible rather than clearer. In a word, love poetry has yielded to that frightening landscape of the biblical apocalypse. This is an extraordinary moment in the comedy, a moment of violent shock and preparation for the final stage of the pilgrim's journey. But before proceeding to talking about the importance and meaning of this event, I want to make a brief digression to introduce a theological concept which became important in the 20th century, because I think it will help us understand the wild and eerie feeling that Dante the poet tries to create in these final, disruptive canti of Purgatorio. The term is the numinous, a term which I borrow from the theologian Rudolf Otto. At the beginning of the 20th century, the German Lutheran theologian Rudolf Otto wrote a famous book called The Idea of the Holy, which influenced, among others, Lewis and Tolkien. In this book, Otto pointed out that modern man has rather lost a sense of what the holy is. We tend to think of holiness as being good, brought to the highest level. In reality, Otto claims, all the ancient languages and primitive religions treat the holy as what he calls an irrational overplus of meaning which extends beyond goodness. Otto claims that holiness contains a certain irrational element which goes beyond simple goodness. In seeking a word for this irrational quality of the sacred, which is on the periphery of language, Otto coined the term numinous, derived from the Latin numen. He says, there is no religion in which the numinous does not live as the real innermost core, and without it, no religion would be worthy of the name. It is preeminently a living force in the Semitic religions, and of these again, and none has it such vigor as it in that of the Bible. Here too it has a name of its own, namely the Hebrew kadosh, to which the Greek hagios and the Latin sanctus, and more accurately still sacer, are the corresponding terms. For Otto, the numinous is that reality whose majesty is so far beyond our ordinary experience that it's difficult for us to classify it simply as good or bad. It's at once both alluring and dangerous, beautiful and terrifying. The numinous is what Tolkien had in mind when he describes Lothlorien, and perhaps what Lewis had in mind when he describes Aslan. Perhaps you remember that little exchange at the beginning of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Mr. Beaver says, Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe? Said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you. The numinous is that overplus of meaning, mysteriously frightening and uncanny. But Rudolf Otto, to better get at this experience, qualifies the numinous in 5 ways. He says it's a mystery. It possesses majesty. It's tremendous. It contains an urgent energy, and it is affascinans, or attracting. A mysterium, or a mystery, is literally a mystery or a secret. In the religious sense, it is wholly other, that which is quite beyond the sphere of the usual, the intelligible, and the familiar, and which therefore falls quite outside of the canny, and is contrasted with it, filling the mind with what Otto calls blank wonder and astonishment. The mystery is different from the problem. The problem leaves you puzzled, like a detective story, until you figure out the missing piece. But the mystery never loses its question-provoking nature, no matter how much you learn about it. It inspires the response of stupor, which signifies, quote, blank wonder and astonishment that strikes us dumb, amazement absolute, end quote. But the numinous can be said to be mysterium, which is tremendous. That is, a mystery which causes fear, religious dread, awe. It has the uncanny. It causes you to shudder, like the weird sisters in Macbeth, because it seems on a different plane of being. But unlike the weird sisters, that which is supremely numinous possesses dread majesty, an overpowering unapproachability. At the same time, Otto says it has an urgent energy, as if it's on the verge of pouring forth, ever going out. Otto says that the mystics refer to this when they write about the consuming fire of God, quote, whose burning strength the mystic can hardly bear, but begs that the heat that has scorched him may be mitigated, lest he be himself destroyed by it, But at the same time, Otto continues, it's a mysterium affascinans. Quote, the divine object may appear to the mind an object of horror and dread, but at the same time, it is no less something that allures with a potent charm, and the creature who trembles before it, utterly cowed and cast down, has always at the same time the impulse to turn to it. It maybe even to make it his own. The mystery is for him not merely something to be wondered at, but something that entrances him. And beside that in which it bewilders him and confounds, he feels a something that captivates and transports him with a strange ravishment, rising often enough to the pitch of dizzy intoxication. It is the Dionysiac element in the Numen. All of these properties exist simultaneously in the Numen. It's frightening, imposing, potent, and wondrous. It feels that it's rushing out while at the same time drawing in. For this reason, it inspires a dread in the creature who comes into contact with it. It inspires a feeling of radical creaturehood. He who has this vision has never before been so conscious of being ash and dust. This then is what I mean by the numinous, or an experience of the sacred. We read about this in the Bible. It's the experience of Isaiah in Isaiah 6, or Ezekiel at the beginning of his work, an experience of awe and terror and fullness. To put all of this succinctly, in the words of Otto, a God comprehended is no God. In any case, it is this perception of the awful majesty of God which Otto thought the modern world needed to recover. In contrast, this sense of the awful sacred presence of God was very present in the medieval world. In particular, we find this sense of the numinous on display in medieval works devoted to exploring the Apocalypse, that is, the last book of the Bible, in which, as medieval scholars thought, the aging John the Apostle had a vision of heaven while he was on the island of Patmos. The book of Revelation, or the Apocalypse, as you know, uses famously difficult and symbolic language about the lady, the beast, the righteous martyrs, the seals and bowls of judgment. In the medieval world, this book was believed by some, and probably by Dante, to tell the inner history of the world. By using secret and mysterious symbols, we could get not just at the facts and dates and names of history, but the real inner spiritual history of man's relation to God. The stages of man's spiritual development from age to age. But in addition to believing that the Apocalypse told us about the spiritual development of man, the medieval reader thought the book, and all its strange and enigmatic language, briefly pulled back the veil of reality and let us see the awful truth of the majesty of God enthroned. This desire to show God in His awful glory is beautifully illustrated in a whole series of Apocalypse commentaries, copied and painted over the course of hundreds of years. One copy, with particularly fantastical illustrations, is one of the world's great treasures of art and one of its most bizarre, the Morgan Beatus. We actually know the illuminator's name, Maius. Maius probably lived in a monastery in northern Spain, just off the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. His book is now called the Morgan Beatus, so called because it's now the property of the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York. The book is a sensory overload. The band of colors, orange, green, yellow, and dark blue, set the background for the party-colored robes of the angels and those associated with the city of Babylon. The motions of the angels and those falling are strangely abstracted from time and space, as if we have exited from the realm of history and entered into the realm of the unchanging truth of God's providence. Similarly, in the depiction of the 144,000 who worship the Lamb, we have a whole group of the just playing instruments, worshiping the Lamb who's on the top of a mountain. In the top register, we have the 4 living creatures mentioned by Ezekiel. Their brightly colored wheels do not move. The strange animal heads with human bodies are fantastical creatures, more from a nightmare. Christ is portrayed with an eerie stillness. He rules from his throne, surrounded by cherubim and seraphim, who literally hold up the starry band which encircles him. Again, we witness the unearthly silent music. Such an image helps us remember that every time someone in the Bible receives a messenger from heaven, they almost begin to cry with fear, and the angel, or the voice of God, has to remind them not to be afraid. For instance, in the book of Isaiah, the prophet reports hearing that, quote, "One cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And the post of the door moved, and the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand. And he laid it upon my mouth, and said, Lo, this hath touched thy lips. And thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged." As we can see, Mayas has chosen to depict the sacred, the eternal, the timeless, not as elegant and beautiful, but as off-putting, frightening, jarring, terribilis. This is truth in the prophetic mode. As the book of Isaiah says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Indeed, this is exactly what the illustrator Maios seemed to be aiming for. At the end of the Morgan Beatus, we have these words written by Maios' own hands. "I have painted a series of pictures for the wonderful words of the stories, so that those who know may fear the coming of the future judgment of the world's end." This is also what our poet was aiming for in these canti, to bring his second canticle to an end in a way as phantasmagorical and brilliant as anything painted in Maios. It shouldn't surprise then that what Dante sees and indeed feels in these last canti is steeped in the imagery of the book of Revelation and Isaiah and Ezekiel. For example, he sees a bizarre procession which comes from heaven and dreamily alights within the garden in order to confront him and then present him with a kind of silent play. He's ordered, like John, to write it all down, although he barely understands what it means. This long parade of symbolic figures is led first by 24 elders carrying lilies. These are followed by 4 beasts with brightly colored wings whose feathers form intricate patterns. Then comes a chariot pulled by a griffin and carrying Beatrice. On one side of the chariot is a group of 3 female figures dressed in the colors of flame red, emerald green, and snow white. They represent faith, hope, and charity. On the other side, a group of 4 ladies dancing, all wearing purple. They represent the cardinal virtues. Then after the chariot come 2 old men, one who is a doctor and one who carries a sword. The 2 old men are followed by 4 humbly dressed men, who are in turn followed by an old man sleepwalking. Canto 30 tells us that 100 angels will join this procession, for a total of precisely 144 members in this sacred parade. Dante doesn't tell us, but it seems likely that the 24 elders are the 24 books of the medieval Old Testament. The 4 living creatures commonly symbolize the 4 Gospels. The 2 old men, probably Luke and Paul, are followed by 4 humbly dressed individuals, Jude, John, Peter, and James, who are in turn followed by the sleepwalker, the author of the Apocalypse. So the Bible, as it were, is processing down to meet Dante. We note how in the passage described above, how painstakingly the poet points out the color of everything, as if he wants us to see his own apocalyptic scene with the eyes of the medieval illuminator, such as Maios. Of course, the whole procession strikes Dante at first like a bolt of lightning, but lightning which doesn't flicker out. We've also talked about how the company leaves the air it passes through painted with bright colors. Then, of course, we note the ladies in bright dresses, the chariot which shines brighter than the sun, the griffin with golden wings and white and a vermilion body, and finally Beatrice's own bright apparel, an olive crown, a white veil, a burning red robe, and a green mantle. But the pilgrim barely registers any of this. He's too stunned by the glory of the event. It takes his eyes a long time to get used to the brilliant radiance of the procession, and throughout he is described as completely stupefied. At 2 points, he turns to Virgil for help in understanding what he is experiencing. On the first occasion, he says, "Full of wonder, I turned to my good Virgil, and he answered with a look no less charged with amazement." The garrulous, avuncular Virgil, always full of calm advice, just shakes his head. He too is completely at a loss to explain this event. Rather, both are lost in the radiant light. How great a contrast from what was expected, from the romantic reunion. Here Beatrice comes, riding in a cart, accompanied by a huge retinue of allegorical figures and saints. But then it gets worse. When she finally arrives, she's brutally personal. She attacks the pilgrim, trying to sting him and elicit his shame. At times, she's even sarcastic. When the disoriented pilgrim turns for help, this one? Okay, yeah. Okay. When the disoriented pilgrim turns for help to his faithful guide and friend, Virgil, he finds he's not there, and Beatrice says, "Do not weep. Do not weep yet. There is another sword to make you weep." She later asks him, "How did you dare approach the mountain? Do you not know that here man lives in joy?" Her method of questioning makes the pilgrim's experience all the more intense. And the fact that she berates him in front of a large audience makes his experience all the more painful. In fact, she's so harsh that the pilgrim passes out, overwhelmed by grief and the surprise of this verbally abusive encounter. Then Beatrice violently jerks Dante into the water and pushes his head under. Beatrice overwhelms. She does not comfort the pilgrim. And finally, the pilgrim is shown a strange allegorical play. The chariot is drawn to a tall tree in the middle of the garden, which seems to be at once the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Dante watches as an eagle tears through the tree, stripping it of its bark, before plunging into the cart and smashing into it. Into this broken cart slinks a skinny little fox, which is then chased off by Beatrice. But after this, the eagle returns to foul the cart with all of its nasty feathers. And this is followed, among other things, by the attack of a dragon. The pageant concludes by showing a harlot sitting in the cart and being dragged away by a giant into the woods. We won't go into all the details, but suffice it to say, all this violence done to the cart represents the fraud, deception, and persecution of the church. The chariot, the church, was meant to be yoked to the nourishing tree of life, but instead the chariot must endure one brutal attack after another. The original attack of the eagle probably represents the persecution of Rome. The eagle's feathers left on the chariot probably represents the good-intentioned but ill-fated gift of Constantine. The harlot being dragged away by the giant suggests the manipulation of the papacy by France in Dante's own day. So what's the point of these final canti? This final unforeseen and shocking reunion? What's the purpose of this elaborate encounter? Why is Dante berated by Beatrice instead of rewarded and complimented? And why does the pilgrim have to go through a sort of second baptism, being washed this time in the river Lethe? I think the only way to understand these mysterious events in the final canti of Purgatorio is as preparation for paradise. Dante has to make a deep confession. You see, throughout Purgatorio, he watched souls develop habitual virtue contrary to their earthly inclinations. But in these final canti, Dante is asked to be horrified, absolutely stupefied at the madness of attempting to fill any earthly vessel with what only heaven can contain. The pilgrim has to go beyond recognizing merely that vice impedes our happiness. He has to be shaken and shocked and overwhelmed in order to develop a radical openness to the burning glory of heaven. Then he will be ready for the final stage of his instruction in the third canticle. But let's speak in more particular terms. Although the poet is intent on giving us an apocalyptic vision of world history, he's equally concerned with making this a very personal scene, an extremely intimate encounter between Dante and his beloved. When Dante first comes into the presence of Beatrice after so many years, he experiences again that trembling which he had felt when he was a young man, and which he described in such vivid terms in his Vita Nuova. Dante can't see her face on account of the veil, but nevertheless, he starts to shake when he draws near her. And in my spirit, which for so long a time had not been overcome with awe, that used to make me tremble in her presence, even though I could not see her with my eyes, through the hidden force that came from her, I felt the overwhelming power of that ancient love. In some ways, then, we've gone all the way back to the Vita Nuova. Dante is, once again, the overwhelmed lover who's shaken by the glory of Beatrice's beauty. In fact, Beatrice can unabashedly say to Dante, "Never did art or nature set before you beauty as great as in the lovely members that enclosed me." Given that her beauty is so great, she asks, how could it have been possible for the pilgrim to be unfaithful? And thus continues, "And if that highest beauty failed you, in my death, what mortal thing should then have drawn you to desire it? Indeed, at the very first arrow of deceitful things, you should have risen up and followed me who was no longer of them." In other words, Beatrice asks, how is it possible, even after her death, that Dante could possibly have settled for anything less? Surely any other attractive thing ought to have seen a pale shadow after you had a real experience of beauty. After drinking wine, how could you stoop to dirty water? Beatrice keeps driving this point home and forcefully elicits a confession from the confused pilgrim. She demands that he admit that he had been unfaithful to her, unfaithful to love, unfaithful to beauty. But the pilgrim can barely whisper his answer. Here's how the poet describes it. "My faculties were so confounded that my voice struggled up but spent itself before it made its way out of my mouth. Confusion and fear mixed together drove from my mouth a yes, but one had need of eyes to hear it. As a crossbow breaks with too much tension from the pulling taut of cord and bow, thus I collapsed beneath that heavy load, and with a flood of tears and sighs, my voice came strangled from my throat." But after this wimpy confession, Beatrice aggressively continues, "And what profit or advantage showed in the face of other things so that you felt you must parade yourself before them?" After heaving a bitter sigh, I hardly had the voice to give the answer. My lips were laboring to shape. In tears I said, "Things set in front of me, with their false delights, turned back my steps the moment that your countenance was hidden." And it is here that Dante makes his radical confession. Those images of false delight now appear paltry and embarrassing and pathetic, especially in light of her whose mere sideways look inspires in the pilgrim, quote, "1,000 desires hotter than any flame." This is that moment of personal judgment, much like what Lewis writes about in Till We Have Faces, in which the person being examined has the painful experience in which now nothing is hidden in the heart any longer. It's available to be viewed by all. And in this moment of complete vulnerability and spiritual nudity, the soul has to let itself be radically known, to feel that all of its secrets are now being viewed by everyone. From this vantage, all the false images of good don't just seem misdirected. They seem pathetic, reprehensible, detestable, sick, and small. This is Dante's deep confession. It constitutes that rare moment in which a human being sees the false images of the world for what they are in the light of eternity. As we've seen throughout these canti, the poor pilgrim is laboring to keep up. He can barely understand what's happening. But when he asks for explanations, Beatrice's words only make things more difficult to understand. For example, Beatrice's explanation of the mysterious pageant just adds to the riddle. Quote, "Know that the vessel the serpent broke was and is no more," she says. She refuses to explain what the eagle stands for, nor does she explain the fox, the harlot, or the giant, but rather says that those figures have to be understood as referring to the 500, 10, and 5. Her words do not untie the knot of the pageant, but here her speech is a, quote, dark narration and a, quote, hard enigma. And so the pilgrim quite understandably asks, "But why does your speech so much desired fly so far above my sight? The more my sight strives, the more it loses it." And Beatrice responds, "So that you may know," she said, "the school you have followed, and see how well its teaching can follow my words, and may see that your way is as distant from God's as the heaven that most hastens on high differs from earth." Dante never mentions what the doctrines are of the school of thought which Beatrice now criticizes. But it seems to me that Beatrice is actually here rebuking not so much false doctrines, but rather a presumptuous mindset which could believe that any set of human rational explanations could effectively communicate the highest truths. Indeed, Beatrice suggests that the very darkness of her words was intentionally planned in order that the pilgrim recognize by how much heavenly realities exceed earthly ones, recognize how poorly equipped the human mind is to understand the opaque celestial truths. Beatrice's dark speeches, the oblique symbolism of the historical play of salvation, and the procession itself all cry out for interpretation, but any attempt to do so in these canti is frustrated. What the drama succeeds in demonstrating, then, is how far above and beyond God's revelatory truth is. God's revelation comes at unexpected interventions within time. It unveils mysteries earlier generations could only gesture at, or in the language of the Bible, mysteries which angels long to look into. The figures in the procession of Purgatorio 29 are the embodiments of the books of the Old Testament and the New Testament, representative of God's second book, that is, Revelation, made in history, which invades, as it were, God's first book of nature. The eruption of scriptural and historical truth in the garden shatters the pilgrim's expectations and serves as an important lesson for the poet. Having broken to bits the pilgrim's confidence in his earlier limited approach, Beatrice can now bid him to note duly her words, her dark words, and the events unfolding before his eyes. Like John, then, Dante is asked to write everything down exactly as he has seen it. In a way, then, this is Dante's ultimate justification for his use of poetry. Back in the lectures on Inferno, I asked the question why Dante would so closely tie his poem to his flight on the back of the strange beast Geryon. Why would such a fanciful flight of the imagination be an appropriate form for his message? But here in the garden, the dreamlike, apocalyptic images which resist rational categorization invade, as it were, the supreme seat of human reason. We have then a de facto announcement that the poetry which is about to follow will be something that has never been seen before, because it will be an attempt to treat what is beyond nature. From here on out, the Virgilian tradition will be able to offer only limited assistance, just as the Roman poet here is of no help. From here on out, the poet will have to strike out on his own. He will have to be radically innovative as he treats something never attempted before. And this is explicitly said at the beginning of the next canticle. "The waters that I enter have never before been crossed."